Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. It would have been nice to have you here in Stockholm. Usually I try to convince my colleagues to organize conference in summer because it's the best period to be here in Sweden, which means like 1 week in June. This year I didn't have to do that. We didn't have to worry about the weather, so we're and now it's a fantastic day, of course. Anyway, let me just remind you what are the rules for today. So presenters have 35 minutes, discussant 15 minutes, and general discussion is 10 minutes. And I remind all panelists that they can ask clarifying questions during the presentation, and then just talk after during the presentation in the general discussion. While people, attendees can ask their question at the end in the Q&A session. And I think that's it. So we can start with the first presentation, and we want to welcome Gernot Muller that will present a paper on the change rate insulation puzzle. And Gernot, you have 35 minutes, and I will tell you when it's 5 minutes to go.
Let me unmute this. Okay, thanks for having me. This is joint work with Giancarlo Corsetti, Kite Küster, and Sebastian Schmidt. Do you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, good. In this paper, we take up what we think is a very old question, classic question if you want, namely to what extent flexible exchange rate insulate economies from foreign shocks. If you ask this question and go back to the classic, you get a resounding yes, I'd say, starting with Mead and Friedman, Mundell, Fleming. This is the way we teach things in Macro 101, I think, still do, at least I still do it this way. So if an economy operates a flexible exchange rate regime, it's better suited to cope with foreign shocks. Perhaps somewhat interestingly, or more, that at least was interesting to us to understand this, that if you not only look at the classics, but say look at the latest vintage of the standard workhorse model, say the dominant currency paradigm as put forward in the recent AER piece by Gopinath and co-authors, you would also find a yes to that answer. And since that came as a surprise to us, I'll be more detailed on this just in a second. So, but the basic idea is all familiar to you guys, of course. So we consider a drop in foreign demand, say to a contractionary policy shift abroad, say monetary policy, this will our baseline scenario. And then if you operate a peg monetary policy, your own monetary policy is constrained to shadow the foreign monetary stance. Now, if you have flexible exchange rate, you're free to choose how far you expand in order to boost domestic absorption, to depreciate the currency, and to generate some expenditure switching. That's the basic textbook narrative. And we argue it's one of the most fundamental ideas in international macro, but there's surprisingly little empirically support, okay? And just to argue that we are not going against the straw man here, we reproduce some figures from that just mentioned paper, Gopinath and co-authors. So in the left panel, you see a reproduction of their panel 2A. And what they do, they have this, I guess most of you are very familiar with that setup. It's a 3-country model. And here you see the responses to a monetary policy shock in the country, which is the dominant currency country, say the US. So that's here indicated with the letter U. And in the left panel, you see the response of output in the US with the greenish or turquoise line, whatever it drops in response to a contractionary monetary policy shock in the US. And you see 2 countries, country G and country R, and both operate flexible exchange rate vis-a-vis that dominant currency country. And you see that their output here, the 2 lines being just on top of each other, does not really respond to that contraction. So here you go. Yeah, this is insulation in the face of a foreign shock. Yeah, in the latest, you know, state-of-the-art model, we argue. Okay, so and this is sort of, you know, just the latest incarnation, and goes back to Mundell-Fleming if you want. And then you see it's still there, this insulation property. That's meant to be illustrated with that reproduction. In the right panel, we contrast this again using the Gopinath et al. Model, and we just change it a little bit. We now assume here that country R operates an exchange rate peg with the dominant currency, so it pegs to the dollar. And then you see its output that's given by the blue dashed line is collapsing in sync with US output. Yeah, so there's no more insulation, as the textbook would say, under the peg, while country G still operates on that float, and so it's insulated from the shock. Okay, so that's the basic notion of the insulation property of flexible exchange rate in the face of external shocks. Very basic. Okay. Now, what we do in this paper, we want to confront this insulation hypothesis with new evidence. And we think this is new because it's based on data from Europe. Yeah. So what we do in this paper, we look at shocks which originate in the euro area, which is only a part of Europe. And so we look at the spillovers from these shocks originating in the euro area, and this will be mostly monetary policy and financial shocks. And we look at how these shocks spill over onto 20 neighbor countries. Yeah, and in doing so and studying these spillovers, we condition on the exchange rate regime in these countries. Yeah, and most we focus on pegs versus floaters. And what's nice about this setup, we think, is this is a relatively rich data set. So it features some 5,000 monthly observation. And importantly, there's huge variation in the exchange rate regime, both across time and across space, because, you know, the monetary history of Europe, even during the last 2 decades, is quite exciting. There's been some changes in the exchange rate regime, and we exploit this variation here. What's the main result? Well, the main result is that we get large spillovers, and more importantly, the exchange rate regime doesn't seem to matter at all for the size of the spillover. That's what we try to call here the exchange rate insulation puzzle. Yeah? So this goes against this notion which I put forward in the beginning, starting with Friedman, Mundell-Fleming up to Gopinath and co-authors, that this insulation which we have in these models is just not there in Europe. Okay. And to set the stage, you know, in order to explore a little bit what's going on from a theory point of view, we work with a model which features in some sense dominant currency pricing as well, because if you look at the euro area, it seems that it is, as a first approximation, it's fair to assume that there is something going on like dominant currency pricing, with the point that it's the euro which is the dominant currency. Yeah, for these 20 neighbors countries, which we do consider here. So each diamond is one of the neighbors. So you see 19 diamonds because we don't have Croatia in there here. That's sort of missing. But for 19 out of 20 countries, you see these diamonds aligning fairly neatly along the 45-degree line. And what you have on the axis, horizontal axis, is the export share in these 20 neighbor countries accounted for by the euro area. And on the vertical axis, you see the euro as invoicing currency in overall invoicing currencies. And you see that this is pretty much the same fraction in these neighbor countries. So suggesting that trade with the euro area, both exports and imports, is invoiced mostly in euros. Okay, so this is when we go to theory. We work with a very simple model, but that model features dominant currency pricing in the sense that the euro is the dominant currency. Yeah, so we're going to use a 2-country new Keynesian model. It's embarrassingly simple. It's a textbook model, if you want, the textbook model. That we assume that the euro area is the foreign country. It's large, And then we have a generic neighboring country, which is small. And the key aspect which we're going to study is monetary policy in that neighboring country. And monetary policy may run a peg. It may operate a float with inflation targeting. And we're going to see to what extent, under which condition, we can rationalize the absence of the insulation. Yeah. And first, we take a more theory point of view, and we try to understand under which conditions we do get output spillovers. We're gonna explore the role of dominant currency pricing relative to producer currency pricing. And we find there is some role here for dominant currency pricing in accounting for these spillovers, but that role is quantitatively quite moderate. So in a final step, we look at what happens when we assume that these neighbor countries operate a float, but at the same time target the CPI rather than domestic inflation. And then quite neatly in this simple model, we get output spillovers under a float, which are just as large as under the peg. And in this sense, we can account for what we find in the data. Yeah. So with the CPI targeting, of course, monetary policy tolerates much less of an exchange rate depreciation. And so that's also consistent with what we have in the data. But then you could say, this is where we end, but this doesn't resolve the puzzle really, because you may ask, okay, why are monetary policy makers ready to tolerate these huge output swings just to fix the CPI? Yeah, so, and we don't have an answer for that really at this point. Okay, so here's some relevant literature. There's work on the role of the exchange rate regime in shaping the transmission of external shocks. But we think there is, at this point, no definitive evidence out there. So that's why we think it's useful to add here a new perspective from Europe. Of course, this relates pretty much to stuff which has been presented here about monetary autonomy and the framework and the set of instruments you use to stabilize open economies. So I can't do justice to all this work. Yeah. And finally, this also relates to the work on the transmission of US monetary policy shock via the global financial cycle. But so we think it's interesting here to study the case of Europe, because arguably you would have thought from the beginning that Europe is here different from the US. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this data set. So it's just Eurostat data basically, but what we think is nice here is that we have quite a variation. So we look at 20 years of data from 99, inception of the euro, to 2018. We look at what's happening in the euro area, but we are also looking at what's happening in these neighbor countries. Yeah? These neighbor countries includes Sweden, I should say here, given the venue. So we have these 20 neighbor countries selected by starting off with the EU 28, well, now 27. And then from those 27 countries, we subtract those countries which were initially on the euro, that's 11 countries. Yeah. Then we add the UK. Yeah, so we have 27 minus 11 is 16. We have the UK. And then to have more variation, we also look at EFTA. EFTA is 4 countries, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, which we didn't include because of its small size. Yeah, so this gives us 20 countries. And in these 20 countries, we look at the exchange rate regime, and the classification starts with Ilsetsky, Reinhardt, and Rogoff. So they have a course scheme with 6 regimes. We narrow it down to 4. So we have the euro adoption that we classify with a 0. Then we have a peg, which is it's a 1. We have intermediate regime, which means fluctuations within plus minus 2% bands. And we have a pure float. Now in our baseline, we look at, in particular, we could look at those countries which operate a pure float. And here we mean to be conservative in the sense that under a pure float, you would expect this insulation property of the exchange rate regime to show, if at all. Yeah. In that sense, we single out the pure floaters. Okay. This table should give you a sense of the variation in these data. So 4,800 observations, 20 countries, 20 years of monthly observations. And each column is a country, and each row here is each line is a month where in one of the 20 countries you see the exchange rate regime changing. Yeah. As I said, we're going to focus on the pure floats relative to all the other countries, and the pure floats are the darkish blue cells with a 3. So this is mostly Iceland. You see Switzerland, they had this episode when they pegged for some 4 years to the euro. Since 2015, they're back to a float. Then there's Norway, there's the UK, there's Sweden. Sweden in the early 2000s was not a pure float according to our classification. So that's why we do not include it in this pure floating group. Yeah. Then you have, say, Poland in the early part of the sample, Hungary or Latvia. And since 2017, for instance, Czech Republic, I don't know whether you're aware, but in 4 years ago, the Czech Central Bank declared that the exchange rate would no longer feature in the monetary policy decisions, okay? So this gives you a sense of variation. Now, this is about the spillovers on these neighbor countries originating from euro area shocks. And to give you a sense of the potential exposure, here you see the share of exports in % of local GDP, in % of that neighbor country's GDP, which goes to the euro area. This is just average values for our sample period. And you see that this exposure can be sizable. It's not as so this is just goods trade. Yeah, so you see UK is only 7%, but Czech Republic is say 43%, Hungary 38% of GDP. Yeah, so there's a sizable exposure. So you could think that if the euro area goes down, this potentially impacts these neighbor countries severely, and then it's a question of whether the exchange rate regime provides some insulation or not. Okay, now shocks. Yeah, we look at shocks, and here we are in a comfortable position, we argue, because we take the shocks straight from Jaroszynski-Garadi's recent work on monetary policy shocks. And what they do, just as a reminder, it's a very well-known study, I believe. So they use a high-frequency approach to identify monetary policy shocks in the euro area. So they look at monetary events, press statements by the ECB, press conference at the ECB, and they look at 30 and 90-minute windows around these events, and they look at the change in the 3-month interest rate forward, yeah, the Ionia swap, and then they basically identify as a monetary surprise the change, the sum in the change during the press statement and the press conference. Yeah. Now, the main focus of Jaroszynski-Garadi is that this monetary surprise is not necessarily a structural shock, because the central bank, the ECB, may have some information which was up to that point not known to the public, not known to financial markets. So it could be that there's a surprise, that what is a surprise is not a genuine monetary policy shock, that is a non-systematic movement in the interest rate, but rather a systematic response to this information which was known to financial markets. So in the language of Jaroszynski-Garadi, this would be a central bank information shock, meaning that interest rates, say, go up because the central bank is telling people, okay, things are going rather well in the euro area. Yeah, and so we understand, financial markets understand this is endogenous response to this better information, but it's still a surprise. Yeah, but it's not a genuine monetary policy shock. So a nice thing, Jaroszynski-Garadi give us both. They give us a time series for monetary policy shocks in the euro area, and they give us a time series for the central bank information shocks. We look at a third shock. We also have a fourth shock, but I don't show it to you here. Let's focus on the third shock. It's a euro area spread shock. Here we build on early work by Gilchrist Marchand. They use firm level data in a bottom-up approach to come up with aggregate series for spreads in the euro area, and they run various time series models to identify spread shocks. We kind of replicate their approach in order to retrieve a time series for the spread shock in the euro area using updated data which is available at the Banque de France. Okay, so these are our three shocks. Jarzynski-Karady give us central bank information shocks and monetary policy shocks, and then we have the spread shocks by replicating some of the work Gilchrist and Monchon did. Okay, endowed with these shocks, we run a very simple regression. We estimate local projections, as I guess most of you do these days, because it's so easy to condition on initial conditions. And here we condition on the exchange rate regime, which is in place in the month prior to the shock. Yeah, so you see that equation in the middle that gives you the dependent variable that could be a measure of economic activity. It's monthly, so we look at industrial production or unemployment, say, as measures of economic activity. We also look at the exchange rate. And here we throw in the shocks, monetary policy shocks, central bank information shocks, and the spread shock. Yeah, we include some controls, which is just lags of the shock and the dependent variable. Now, the key thing here is this dummy variable, yeah, which we set to 1 whenever we look at a pure float. And then this guy here, the psi f, gives us a direct estimate of the impulse response, conditional that the country operates a pure float. And 1 minus that dummy variable would be the rest, the peg and the intermediate, if you want. Okay, that's the setup. Here's the result. Yeah, main result. We look at first at monetary policy shock, what it does in the euro area. Industrial production contracts. It's a nicely shaped response, I guess, in line with the received wisdom. Consistent with that decline in industrial production, you see unemployment gradually building up. Yeah. Now, what's happening in the middle column is the response for the pegs, including the intermediates. Yeah, and you see pretty large spillovers. Yeah, the size of the shock, so the scale is the same in all panels from left to right. Yeah, so you see the peg response is comparable to what is happening in the euro area. So there are large spillovers in that sense. But the main result is the right column. Yeah, because here in the right column you see the response if you operate a float, and you see that here the spillovers are no smaller under the float than under the pegs, and the same with unemployment. Okay, so in this sense there are sizable spillovers, and the exchange rate regime doesn't seem to make a difference whatsoever. Yeah. So here we look at the HICP, Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices. Again, similar adjustment patterns. We look at interest rates in the euro area. We look at the interest rate differential for peggers and floaters in the policy rate. And importantly, you see that there is some monetary tightening both in the peg and on the float. Last figure, you see the euro area effective exchange rate in the left panel. It's appreciating gradually, so there's some undershooting on impact. Yeah, and then gradually the euro appreciates against all major currencies. Now, if we look at peg and float, we see the price of the euro. You see the peggers or intermediates are not responding much. And then you see some response of the exchange rate for the floaters. So it's a 0.5% depreciation against the euro.
Gernot, may I just ask a quick question? Was it, so did the other countries tighten, did the floaters and the peggers, did they tighten the monetary policy response in tandem with ECB, or what was the, can you just, what is the delta policy rate? I just
thanks, yes. But this is the relative policy rate that I forgot to mention. The delta is meant to indicate this. So this is neighbor minus euro area. So it's tighter relative, it's even tighter than what we have in the euro area.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jesper. Okay, so here's the next shock. Same picture, basically, in the sense that the central bank information shock generates an expansion. That's what Jarzynski-Karady would tell us. Yeah, and so it's expansionary, industrial production increases, unemployment goes down. Now, it's basically the same effect for the peg, both in terms of industrial production and unemployment. And now, most importantly, right column gives you the response for the float. And you see, again, spillovers no smaller than what you have under the peg. Here's again the other variables like CEPR and interest rate differentials. Here's the exchange rate. In the interest of time, I'll be brief here. And I turn to the last shock, which is the credit shock. Okay, and here again, similar picture, sizable spillovers. And I guess it's still fair to say that under the float, you don't have much insulation, although the effect is here a little bit less clear than what we had before. Okay, so now here's the important aspect. Of course, most of you may have thought about this the whole time, so I have been silent on this. So, of course, there's very influential work by Helen and others, which looks at the transmission of US monetary policy shock, and it's been understood by now that it operates through the global financial cycle. We understand US monetary policy impacts asset prices and the VIX, and in that scenario, we see in response to a monetary contraction in the US, capital flows contracting, and as a result, global industrial production contracts. And importantly, for what we are doing here, also countries which operate afloat seem to be not insulated in the face of US monetary policy shock. I think that is Helen's point. Yeah. So could be something like this going on in Europe as well. I mean, we wouldn't have thought so, because we thought that is somewhat related to the special. Helen's point is related to the special role of US and US monetary policy in the global financial system. So we didn't expect this to matter much, but still we thought, okay, it's worthwhile to include the VIX and the V stocks as controls in our specification, in our empirical model, and it's straightforward to do, and this is what we get. Yeah. So the blue responses is what we get once we include these controls, and by way of comparison, I include the red line as what I showed you before, just to see that it makes a difference. So including these financial variables as a control reduces the spillovers quite a bit. Another way to put this is that some of the international spillovers may operate through financial variables, and once we control for them, the spillovers get smaller. But what's most important here for us is that the relative impact, PEG versus float, is still unchanged, meaning there is still no insulation under the float. This is for the monetary policy shock, this is for the central bank information shock, and this is for the credit shock. So bottom line, spillovers get smaller, but again, under the float, there is no insulation. Okay, how do we think about this? Here's some thoughts based on a standard new Keynesian open economy model. Everything is textbook stuff. Yeah, so we have two countries. Euro area we call foreign, home we call the neighbor country. Yeah, so I'm living in the euro area. For me, it's hard, but I guess, yeah, it's a nice exercise. Yeah, so to put ourselves in the shoes of a neighbor, a citizen in the neighbor country of the euro area, and call this home, this small open economy. Yeah, and then we look at monetary policy in home and distinguish exchange rate peg from flexible exchange rate plus inflation targeting. In our baseline, for reasons I gave you in the beginning, we assume dominant currency pricing, but we also look at PCP to understand the difference. The model is standard, so I can be very brief. The nice thing is the foreign country, the large economy, operates like a closed economy. And so here you really have the three equations, new Keynesian model, as usual, Phillips curve, dynamic IS equation, and an interest rate rule. And this model, of course, we can solve in a straightforward way with paper pencil, and that's the solution for output in the euro area, which contracts in response to a monetary policy shock. Okay, nothing new here. The interesting thing is how does home, the small open economy neighbor country, behave? And here in the baseline, we have the CEPR, as a result of which there is a law of one price gap here, M. We have two Phillips curve, but it's all standard stuff. And what we then contrast is the behavior on the exchange rate peg, domestic inflation target, and a CPI target. Now, this is one theory slide, if I want to be bold here, to fix ideas, because to understand these output spillovers, of course, it is useful to decompose the output response into the response of potential output and the output gap. And when you solve for the home potential output, that is output assuming that prices were flexible in home, you see how it co-moves with foreign output, and there's some spillovers onto potential output, and they are governed by the trade price elasticity, eta, and they can be positive or negative depending on eta. So if either is smaller than 1, you have home and foreign goods being complements, and that gives you a positive co-movement of potential output in home with foreign output abroad. Okay, so if foreign economy tanks, yeah, potential output in home declines to the extent that either is smaller than 1. Now, if you assume the knife edge case, trade price elasticity being 1, then potential output is insulated from the shock, but output may still move. Output may move because the output gap is non-zero. Now, under inflation targeting, assuming you have PCP, there's divine coincidence. If you target domestic inflation, the output gap is closed and you have no spillovers. Okay. If instead you have DCP, dominant currency pricing, then you break divine coincidence. And so if you target domestic inflation, you get some output spillovers. That's the story. Yeah? Some non-zero output spillovers. Okay, so that's the theory. Yeah. So whether you get spillovers on output depends on the response of potential output and on the response of the output gap. And the response of potential output depends on the trade price elasticity, and the response of the output gap, assuming inflation targeting, depends on whether there's PCP and DCP. That's our way to structure the discussion in the paper. And then we turn to model simulations, because we want to know to what extent this matters quantitatively, and we simulate the standard model assuming conventional values. I mean, the only thing to highlight here is maybe here in our simulation, we assume a trade price elasticity of 2/3, which is low, but this is the condition for having potential output declining with foreign output, as I showed you before. Now, here's the simulation. So we look at a shock to monetary policy in the euro area. This is the response in the euro area. Output declines, inflation declines, interest rates goes up. Okay, that's the background. Now, how is this affecting our domestic economy? Oops. So this depends on what you target in terms of inflation targeting. In the upper panel, you see the output response assuming domestic inflation target. In the bottom panel, you see the output response assuming CPI target. Makes a big difference. In which sense? Look at the left column. The left column gives you the output response in the euro area. It collapses by 0.7% monetary contraction in the euro area. How does it spill over? Well, if you operate a peg, the spillover is 1-for-1. If you operate a float, it depends. Yeah? If you target domestic inflation in the upper panel here, you see that under PCP output drops a little bit. This is just the reduction in potential output. Why? Because here under PCP with domestic inflation targeting, the output gap is closed. And so the only drop in output comes from the drop in potential output, yeah. But this is quantitatively tiny, yeah. And we have a trade price elasticity of 2/3, so there's not much going on here with spillovers, yeah, under PCP. Now, if you move to DCP, you get larger spillovers for the reason I just gave you, because then divine coincidence breaks, so you get a non-zero output gap, okay. Negative output gap, that is, and so you get a larger spillover, but still it's a far cry from what you get under a peg. Okay.
And you have 5 minutes.
Okay, so then I'm too fast. Yeah, good. So I should slow down a little bit. This is great. This is again in the upper panel. You see the results for the domestic inflation targeting. So we just played around with it, and once we assume CPI, there's an easy resolution to the puzzle, if you want, because once you do CPI targeting, see what happens in the bottom panels. Yeah, again, this is output in the euro area, collapses after monetary contraction, get a response to the peg, almost 1-for-1 complete spillover. And now look what's happening under the float. Under the float, you see almost no difference between PCP and DCP, but the important thing is now the spillover is almost as large under the peg, and the insulation property is gone. So of course, you're all, you know, understand what's going on, but let me give you a little bit more details here. So here you see responses of individual variables for different monetary policy strategies. So in red, you have the peg. This is when you get the largest drop in output. Yeah, if you target producer price inflation, there's hardly any response of output for the reason I just gave you. This is under PCP, but the results under DCP I show you in a second look very similar quantitatively. Now, if you target CPI, output drops almost as much as under the PEG. That's what we saw before. So what's going on? I mean, the idea is, let's first look at PCP, the blue line. What happens in the baseline with PCP targeting is that the exchange rate depreciates big time. Yeah. Consumer prices increase. The openness, I should say, in this economy is 40%. So 40% in the CPI is accounted for by import. There's complete exchange rate pass-through. So CPI shoots up. Yeah. Now, if you want to prevent this from happening as monetary policy, if you target the CPI, yeah, what do? Rather than letting your interest rate decline a little bit, you check it up. Yeah, that's the green response. As a result of this tighter interest rate, the exchange rate depreciates quite a bit less. And you remember in the data, we saw also a rather moderate response of the exchange rate in response to these foreign monetary policy shocks under float. So consistent with this pattern, you also have a moderate response here, although this is not a serious quantitative mapping, as you understand. Okay, so and then you get an output collapse. But what is also important to emphasize here, this output collapse under CPI, the green line here, is because you have tighter policy and less of a depreciation. But here, let's look at net exports in the lower right panel. You see that net exports are now declining less, okay? But you see this generally quantitatively, this is measured in percentage points of output. You see net exports are for nothing. Yeah, they account for nothing in this adjustment. So it's really domestic absorption. So the exchange rate depreciation is important here in order to understand what's going on. What's going on is a tighter monetary policy which kills domestic absorption. And this is what accounts for the output spillover rather than, say, expenditure switching. Okay. And now let's look at the same scenario under DCP. And I told you it looks the same. Here's a fourth line, which makes this a bit messy. So what's this fourth line? That is output gap targeting. Yeah. And we include this output gap targeting here to make the point that in principle, of course, monetary policy can stabilize the output gap if it adjusts interest rates accordingly, if it lowers interest rates. But that would pay a high price in terms of consumer price inflation, yeah, because that would mean even more depreciation and so forth. So, but it's really a matter of being able to or willing to. Yeah, monetary policy is clearly able to stabilize the output in our setup here with by lowering interest rates appropriately, but it doesn't want to provide once we assume CPI targeting. Okay, so to conclude, what we call here the exchange rate insulation puzzle is that when we look at output spillovers from the euro area, we find large spillovers, and importantly, they are no smaller for floaters. In theory, this could be because of DCP. Quantitatively, however, we find that this aspect accounts for a small fraction of the spillovers. We can explain this rather easily by assuming a CPI target, but then one could ask, okay, the deeper puzzle perhaps is that monetary policy is ready to swallow these output movements just to keep the CPI stable. Thank you.